that have joined by, for those of you that have been joined only by phone, you would hit *9. That would basically raise your hand, and then we can unmute you, and you would hit *6. The chat feature is open, and we really encourage you to ask questions, provide comments, observations throughout the presentation. So feel free to use that, and there'll be several folks monitoring the chat to answer any questions as we work through. As you noted, the recording is for the presentation. We wanted to record the presentation today so we can post it on the website. So if you know of any colleagues or friends that wanted to attend but couldn't tonight, there will be a presentation available on the website for them to view. So here's the folks that have joined us today with their names. I would really like to see who's joined us from the public. So if you could put into the chat your name, if you're a Monterey Park resident or business owner or a visitor, and if you happen to represent any particular agency or group or company, please add that to the chat. So I encourage all of you to go ahead and start introducing yourselves. Okay, so while we see who's joined us in the chat, I'd like to give you a background on the housing element itself. So the housing element is a chapter in the city's general plan. It's similar to the other chapters that we have in the general plan, like land use and circulation and safety. The housing element is required by the state to be updated every 8 years. And so we're now entering that update cycle called the 6th housing cycle. And it's intended to cover 2021 to 2029. And unlike any other chapter in the general plan, the housing element has to be approved by the state. It's a state agency called Housing and Community Development, or HCD for short. So as many of you may be aware, the city did undergo a recent update to the land use chapter of the general plan. And that update involved changing allowed land uses in certain parts of the city, changing the intensity of the development, density levels. And the land use element went out to the voters to review, and they agreed to the changes to the land use element last year in November 2020. So now we're looking to update the housing elements, and the difference between the housing and the land use element is the housing element is really intended to confirm that there are enough properties that are with allowable uses and densities to meet the regional and local housing needs that are mandated by the state and regional agencies. At this time, we don't anticipate having to make any changes to the land use designations or density standards that were approved through the land use element project. So this slide shows the housing element objectives as established by the state. The purpose of a housing element is to accommodate housing for community members from all segments of the socioeconomic spectrum, to facilitate housing that's considered accessible to people with different needs, to remove government barriers that prevent housing construction, to preserve existing housing that's considered affordable, and to ensure equal housing opportunities. So these objectives are pretty abstract concepts, so I'd like to break this down a little bit more and speak to you about the concept of affordable housing. So the state specifically defines housing that's considered attainable for everybody. And it's defined that way when the average median household income spends 30% or less of their monthly income on rent or mortgage payments. So for Monterey Park, the average median income is around $61,000. 30% of $61,000 is equal to $1,700. So if you're paying rent at $1,700 a month or less, that's considered affordable as the state defines it. Or you're paying out a $1,700 mortgage payment, which is about a $300,000 home. That would be considered affordable. Now in Monterey Park, we found that more than half of the renters in Monterey Park spend more than 30% of their monthly income on housing. And similarly, homeowners in Monterey Park about 51% pay more than 30% of their monthly income. So the idea of the housing element is really to address some of these housing affordability challenges by looking at policies and programs that the city can implement throughout the next 8 years for the housing element. So the housing element does not require the city to build the units that we're planning for. It doesn't authorize construction on any properties that we identify as being good candidates for housing construction, and it doesn't provide funding for affordable housing as well. It's definitely purely a policy document, a planning document for the city to use. So I just wanted to pause now for a minute, and we'd like to ask everyone here some quick questions. And so if you've joined us virtually, you should see a polling question window pop up, and it would be great if you could go through it and answer it, and then we could look at the results and see who we have joining us today. Just give you guys a minute to fill it out.
Hi, sorry, I had a question. My name is Tammy Sam. I'm a current planning commissioner. Am I allowed to fill out that poll, or am I not allowed to?
Oh yeah, you are, absolutely. Please go ahead.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, just let a few more results trickle in. Okay, Dylan, let's go ahead and close it and take a look at the results. So it looks like the majority of people in attendance today live in Monterey Park, with 40, only 40% working in Monterey Park. And the majority of attendees have lived here for a long time. And we have some folks that rent, but the majority are homeowners joining us today, with 76% in single family, and the remaining distributed across different apartment buildings. So thanks for filling that out. And thank you for the chat. I see that there's folks have introduced themselves and are commenting, so great, keep those coming. All right, so let's break down the housing element in a little bit more detail. So this slide shows the different sort of key chapters of a housing element, where you've the community profile in the top left is a discussion of the demographics, community characteristics, housing stock characteristics in Monterey Park. Then in the top right, we look at the housing constraints, and this is looking at what barriers are in place, both market and governmental constraints that might prevent housing from being built. And then there's the community plan, and this is where the objectives and programs that the city can put into place to address housing needs is located. And then the last part of a housing element are the housing resources. This is where we identify potential properties in the city that would be good candidates to allow for future housing construction. So I'll talk a little bit about each one of these. So we did some review of community characteristics and housing stock, and we're presenting some of the results here. So the dominant land use in Monterey Park is residential, with a mix of industrial, commercial, and school and recreational facilities. A little over half live in homeowner occupied housing, and 48% are renting. As I said earlier, the median household income is $61,819. there are around 14% of Monterey Park residents that live below the poverty level, which is a little bit under the LA County average. And the number of people that have college degrees is on par with LA County, around 30% of the population. We also looked at housing needs to look at evaluated disability data to understand what types of needs for accessible housing units are present here in Monterey Park. And this shows the variety of disabilities of folks that are in Monterey Park. And the most common disability is ambulatory, which is an impairment that prevents or impedes walking. We also looked at overcrowded conditions, and we found that around 400 owner-occupied and 1,600 renter-occupied households have more than one occupant per room, which is what the state defines as overcrowded. And almost 600 renter-occupied units have more than 1.5 occupants per room, which is considered severe overcrowding. We also looked at the age of the housing stock to understand how the historical development patterns have contributed to the city's form. And we found that the time period where there was the highest share of Monterey Park housing units constructed was in the 1950s, 1950 to 1959. So moving on to housing constraints, this is where we identify barriers to building housing. So, you could see that there was a general trend of housing construction slowing down over the last few decades, and there might be some specific barriers for that. There are economic barriers that are present in Monterey Park and the region, certainly. There's the cost of construction, there's the cost of land. There's very little vacant land in Monterey Park. There's also a lot of smaller lots that would require consolidation. So you have to buy them from several homeowners in order to build new construction. And then in general, construction costs are quite high in California. We also examined government constraints, looking at city adopted rules and codes to see if there's barriers to development. And with the land use element update, a lot of barriers were removed, which allowed for changes in density and allowed residential and commercial corridors. We also looked at the permit process to see if there's any barriers, and it's fairly typical for other cities in the region, where you have from permit counter approval to design review, board approval, and planning commission approval. So it varies depending on the type of project being proposed. We looked at other constraints like environmental, such as biological resources or safety hazards, and then infrastructure constraints, looking at the capacity to service new housing with water, sewer, and other amenities. So we now want to turn our attention to the programs that help address housing needs and try to understand from you what you think the condition of housing is in Monterey Park. So we have another set of polling questions. So Dylan, if you could launch that. Thank you. I'll give you guys a moment to fill it out. And I see a question from Poonam in the chat. And yes, we will be sharing the map that shows the properties where we think there could be a good candidate for developing housing. And there will be a website as well for you to take a closer look. So we'll showcase that later today. Okay. I think it's good to not seeing too many results come in. All right, let's close it out. Okay, so it looks like we have a somewhat satisfied with the housing choices currently available, but 30% are somewhat dissatisfied, and 14% are very satisfied, and 14% are very dissatisfied, so a mix. In terms of ranking affordability, right around in the middle, not very affordable. So somewhere right in the middle in terms of the affordability rate for Monterey Park. And we have a mix. It seems most of the homes we all live in need rehabilitation, but there is a large percentage of folks that live in excellent condition homes. And over half do not know of anyone that risked losing their home, but almost 30% do know of someone that has been at risk of losing their home or has experienced that themselves. So thank you so much for sharing. Okay, so that's enough talking on my part. This is a chance for us to hear from you. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And we wanted to ask some questions and then encourage folks to either answer in the chat or raise their hands. And again, if you're joining by phone, you would hit *9 to ask to be unmuted. So with the information today that you've seen,
between what you were speaking about and asking questions of and what this next topic covers. So I'm speaking to the fourth chapter of the housing element, which is the housing resources chapter, which provides an analysis of the city's housing resources and prioritizes how to meet future housing needs of the city, specifically with the sites, where they can go, and how we determined the locations for these sites, the sites that would work best. And then I will also speak to the regional housing needs assessment. So next slide, please. So here's a diagram of the regional housing needs assessment, also commonly referred to as RHNA. So the state, the HCD assesses the needs of the entire state and then allocates a certain number to the regional governments. In this case, it's SCAG, and then SCAG determines the housing need for each jurisdiction. So, and then they determine how many sites Monterey Park needs to accommodate in their sites inventory. So here are the numbers for Monterey Park, 2,146 lower income units, 840 moderate income units, and 2,263 above moderate income units. HCD's definition of each income category is defined below. So for a lower income unit, it would be affordable for a household that has an area median income of 0 to 80% of the county area median income. And same with moderate income, 81 to 120%. And then above moderate, it's 120% and over. So next slide, please. Okay, so we started, so we focused first on the vacant and underutilized sites in the city. There's not many vacant sites in the city. There's a handful. So we really focused on the non-vacant sites that would have a high density and would be able to accommodate just lower income housing. We also looked at ADU production, how many ADUs the city has been permitting in the last few years. And then we've extrapolated that over the 8 years just to see how many ADUs we can assume during this planning period. We've also looked at any sort of pipeline projects, and the definition of that is any project that's currently in planned and approved that can be that will be developed during the 8-year cycle. And then based on this initial inventory, we have a few findings. We found that the underutilized sites in the city can accommodate RENA allocation and rezoning will not be required. And these sites will be consistent with the land use element update that happened recently. Next slide. So here is a map of the sites that we have identified. There were a lot of comments of identifying mixed use sites along Garfield, along Garvey, and along Atlantic, and that's exactly what we did. We also identified areas that are zoned for the R3 zone, which is the highest density for residential in the city. So the orange boxes represent the non-vacant sites. So that just means that there's already an existing use. So the existing uses are typically either commercial units or commercial uses, and then low density single family residences. So we've identified those as likely candidates that could be identified for redevelopment. And I just want to stress, and this has been mentioned before, that think of it as a zoning exercise. The city has to show that they can accommodate the RENA numbers. They don't have to build the units. And as of right now, with this strategy we have implemented, the city can accommodate the RENA number.
So I wanted to switch my screen, Jason, and show the mapping exercise. And then maybe you can talk us through how that's going to work so folks can see how to provide their input.
Okay. Okay. Could you press I agree? Thanks.
Yeah, so this is a website link that you'll get if you go to the project website, which I think, Dylan, maybe you can paste that into the chat. And then this is the landing page.
Yeah. So an interactive map and public comment tool has been created for this site's inventory. It's pretty straightforward and user-friendly. There are 3 steps on the top. So what you can do is you can zoom in to any site that you want to explore further. And you can select that site, and then you can provide a comment on that parcel number, which you will see if you click it. You can rank it if it's a good candidate, a moderate candidate, or a poor candidate, and you can leave a comment expressing your thoughts. There's also a few filters on the left-hand side of the screen. You can filter out how many units each site. If you want to look at only sites that would accommodate more than 5 units, you could hit 5, and then it'll show you the sites that would accommodate that. And you can also look at acreage is greater than, so you can filter that out as well. So you can look at, if you want to see sites that are above 1 acre, and so on and so forth. So the blue sites are the non-vacant sites, and the red are the vacant sites.
Okay, I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint.
Tammy has a question.
Okay.
You are unmuted, Tammy.
Hi, I wanted to talk about a couple of things that you showed on the slide. So the previous planning manager was Samantha, and I had talked to her about the number of ADU applications in the first half of 2020. There were only 4 applications, and none of them have been approved when I talked to her. So I think the number of ADUs that we're expecting to see in the city is really not that high. And this graph that you have up, or this chart that you have up, I mean, what I'm getting from this discussion is really the city is showing where we can do it, what we can do. And yes, we meet the 5,200, but this is where theory starts to break away from reality, because the city is making it so difficult to actually build an ADU or to legalize an ADU or build extra units on your own property, that it basically deters most people, most homeowners. As the slides earlier showed, that median income is only $6,200 or $62,000 a year, right? So, for example, to legalize an ADU, to underpine the foundation and to rebuild it, we're getting quotes of about $100,000. That means you have to save up for 2 to 3 years after taxes. Don't go anywhere, don't do anything but do the bare basics to afford to bring an ADU up to code. Most residents don't have that kind of money to throw around. So even though you guys are saying, yes, we have the capacity to do it, in reality, you're not allowing your residents to do that because it is too cost prohibitive. So I just think that this is just a pretty picture. You're really not allowing people to do this. And also the previous slide, could you go back to the other slide that you had up? So most of what you're talking about is really new construction. What about existing units? I think there's not enough talk about that. Instead of just thinking about how we can get brand new shiny units, what about the stuff that we already have? How about legalizing that? Like I said before, we can be well onto our RENA goals if we just allow residents to legalize what they already have. And there's so many cities that have already done it. Like I said, San Jose, that's a great example. If you go to the Housing and Community Development website, they actually have a list of cities that are doing an outstanding job at helping meet the RENA goals. And I think that maybe the city of Monterey Park, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can look at what other cities are doing and maybe take some ideas there. And I think that we should not only be thinking of new construction, should be thinking of what we already have in stock and legalizing it, because the state does allow us to use existing unit stocks towards our RENA goal. Thank you.
I'm going to just jump in real quick with respect to ADUs and the city's process. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about that. Every piece of property is different within the city of Monterey Park. Every person's situation is different. Not all ADUs fit on lots. Not all ADUs can meet the actual setback requirements or other requirements that are already stipulated and prescribed by the state. And at the same time, there's a lot of opportunities where there are units that are maybe illegally constructed or they are going through the process. The city has, and speaking to a couple of the commenters, the city has actually streamlined the process for ADUs. And although it was mentioned that only 4 had been permitted, I can tell you that we've had numerous inquiries and we have numerous ADUs that come through our particular office on a weekly basis, and where the people are getting pre-approval so that they can submit for plan checks. So the ADU use is on the uptake. It is something that is becoming more popular, and we definitely are seeing more of them being proposed within the city. But again, everybody's situation is different. So, we take each particular case and we analyze it to make sure that it meets the requirements under the ADU ordinance, and we proceed from there. So I just wanted to kind of dispel not so much some of the rumors that are out there, but the city has taken opportunities to enhance the process and to make it as easy as we can, while still adhering to the various code requirements under the zoning code, as well as the building code. Thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to speak a little bit to some of the questions in the chat. There's one comment or question about, it looks like the map shows vacant, non-vacant sites have already been identified. Yes, that's correct. We've identified properties that we think can help meet this housing allocation of 5,000 plus. If you have properties that you think are good candidates that are not shown on the map, then I think if you could identify those locations and send an email to the, we can provide it to the MPK housing email address, and we'd be happy to take that into consideration. And I think, Jason, you answered some of the others. There's one comment about overlaying environmental factors to look at suitability and desirability of the potential parcels shown. Maybe Jason Montague or Jason Moquin, you could speak to sort of the approach that we used in terms of any kind of environmental constraints.
Certainly, there was a couple questions that actually came up. So when we looked at this exercise, we really looked at it from the first perspective of we don't want to have to go back and amend the general plan land use element again. We just went through that exercise, and for those that have followed the exercise in the city of Monterey Park, it was actually voted down in March of 2020, and ultimately we did gain voter approval for it in November of 2020. We didn't want to go back and have to rehash looking at sites that were already looked at originally in the land use element. So it really was a focus of concentrating our efforts on the land use that was already existing and where we could see opportunities for potential lands that we identified as being underbuilt to where we could go back and whether it be a property owner, whether it be developer, assemble multiple parcels and actually create a much more inviting development if that's the case. The second component of that is there are lands within the city that do have environmental constraints. There are certain areas that have landfills or that were adjacent to landfills that are not suitable housing sites. And for that reason, some of those vacant lands were not identified as part of this process. So hopefully that answers those questions.
Hi, Reem, I have a question. During these discussions about housing units, Sybil Brand, the vacant Sybil Brand jail site, and there's an adjoining large parcel of land were brought up as possible sites for multiple housing units, given that the jail is no longer in use. It needs to be torn down no matter what. And it would definitely be a great location to build housing up. Did the city consider that? And if so, what was the discussion regarding the Sybil Brand site?
Here's Sebastian, is this the area that's going to be located to the west of the 710 freeway?
Yes. Is that in there? The map was small enough. I couldn't really see. So is that included in as a possible location? It
was not, because again, the city's land use element that was updated identified that particular properties that were west of the 710 as being technology or for light industrial type uses or institutional type uses. It was not designated as residential under the updated general plan land use element that was adopted and ratified by the voters in November. That is the reason why those particular sites were not looked at. In addition to that, there are environmental constraints on some of those properties in that particular area. So again, it does not always make them suitable for housing.
May I ask what kind of environmental constraints there are?
Well, when you look at particular properties, when you look at anything that may be on a former landfill or adjacent to a landfill, it would require additional environmental analysis to determine whether or not you could even build on it or build residential in the future. So those type of constraints are the ones that we would have to further analyze, and it would not be analyzed with the housing element.
Okay, so just to be clear, the jail site was built on a landfill? Is that?
No, I'm saying these are reasons why we don't identify all sites, because there are sites in the city that do have landfill areas, there are other environmental constraints. So this exercise doesn't go and look at the deep detail of those environmental constraints. And again, because of the fact that these particular properties were already identified as being institutional under the 2020 land use element update, we did not look at those as being viable sites.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I do recognize that there are some folks with their hands raised and you've been waiting patiently, so I appreciate that. I think what we'd like to do is just wrap up just a few more slides on next steps, so just folks can see kind of the immediate steps that the housing element team will be doing, so you can track and follow the work and look at future opportunities to engage. And then at the end of that, we can come back to folks with more questions and that have raised their hands. So I'm gonna share my screen again, and then we'll wrap it up really quickly. So this is the project schedule. The housing elements update is going to be going through a few more rounds of community workshops and stakeholder focus group meetings. And then eventually it'll make its way to the Planning Commission and City Council as part of study sessions and public hearings. There will be drafts made available of the housing element. And something we haven't discussed at this workshop, but will be part of subsequent workshops, is looking at the safety and environmental justice elements. Safety element is an existing chapter of the general plan. Environmental justice will be a new chapter of the general plan. And both will be updated in keeping with state rules. The housing element draft will be made public and will also be submitted for formal review by the state, the California Department of Housing and Community Development. They have a 60-day window by which to comment. We will also be releasing a Environmental Quality Act document for public comment as well. And all of these activities will occur sort of late summer, early fall, eventually culminating with the certification of the housing element. So this online mapping tool that we showcased today, it just was launched a few hours before this workshop, and we're looking to solicit your comments to September 3rd. So please be sure to go to the website and add your comments to those sites. And as I mentioned, we'll be providing more information about the other 2 chapters of the general plan update at the next workshop. So here's some key contact information, the email address, as well as a phone number to reach, and our project website, which is regularly updated with information. If you'd like to be on a regular e-blast, please sign up at the project website or send an email to this address. And Dylan, if you haven't done it yet, if you could send the email address, that would be great.